You are sitting at your desk, staring at a completely blank document. Or maybe it is a canvas, a job application, or the registration page for a class you have always wanted to take. Your hands are hovering over the keyboard. You have the desire. You have the time. But suddenly, an overwhelming wave of dread washes over you. You type one sentence, stare at it, decide it sounds terrible, and immediately delete it. The cursor blinks at you, mocking your hesitation. You tell yourself you will do it tomorrow when you feel more inspired. But tomorrow comes, and the blank page remains. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the lack of ideas. It is the heavy, suffocating realization that if you actually try, you might prove that you are not good enough. Personality changes rarely happen overnight in dramatic cinematic moments. They happen so gradually that people almost never notice them taking place. They begin as ordinary behaviors, which turn into daily repetitions, which create subtle psychological effects, which slowly calcify into the traits we eventually call our personality. The question we have to ask is not simply why you feel stuck, but rather, what if some parts of your personality are not simply who you are, but what you have practiced for a very long time? Think of the mind like a path through a forest. Walking through the forest once doesn't create much of a path, but walk in the same direction every day, and the grass slowly bends. The soil compacts. Eventually, the path becomes easier to follow than the untouched woods around it. The brain can work in a similar way. What we repeatedly practice can become easier to repeat. Repeated behaviors and thought patterns can deeply influence our attention, our emotional responses, our expectations, our habits, our self-perception, our coping patterns, and our automatic reactions. This does not mean that your personality is completely determined by your habits or that your fear of trying is entirely your fault. Personality is incredibly complex, shaped by early environment and social conditioning. The goal here is not to suggest a deterministic transformation, but to explain how gradual influence works. Because once you understand how your brain learns to fear being wrong, you can begin to teach it something else. You finally decide to write that story, start that fitness routine, or build that website. You do it for 20 minutes. It is clumsy, awkward, and deeply imperfect. Instead of being proud that you started, you immediately feel a rush of embarrassment. You look at your messy first attempt and compare it to the polished final products of experts. You immediately close the laptop or put away the tools. You tell yourself that you simply don't have the talent. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the difficulty of the task. It is the visceral physical discomfort of allowing yourself to be bad at something. Maybe you call yourself a perfectionist. Maybe you think you simply have high standards for your own work. Maybe you've started believing that being highly critical is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally disciplined. This is where the psychology of ego preservation and intolerance of the beginner's state becomes interesting. When you care deeply about an outcome, your ego attaches your fundamental worth to the result. Doing something poorly creates an immediate threat to your self-esteem. Quitting creates an immediate relief from that threat, and that relief can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate giving up with safety from feeling incompetent. The problem is that what protects your pride today can make the act of learning feel like an impossible humiliation tomorrow. You might see this bleed into your daily life. You refuse to speak a foreign language you are learning unless your accent is flawless, or you won't paint unless you know the painting will be a masterpiece. It is like refusing to walk into a gym until you are already in perfect physical shape. At first, you think you are just being efficient. But eventually, you never get strong because you refuse to lift the light weights. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we practice. They change our fundamental willingness to experience growth If you repeatedly quit when things look messy, you may gradually become more comfortable with unfulfilled potential than honest vulnerability. If you repeatedly demand perfection from your first attempts, being a beginner may begin to feel less like a temporary state and more like a permanent identity crisis. If you repeatedly practice avoiding the friction of a steep learning curve, growth itself may begin to feel incredibly dangerous. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have protected you in an academic environment that punished mistakes. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally incapable of finishing things. Maybe you've simply trained yourself to use perfectionism as a respectable excuse to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of the learning process. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced allowing your work to be delightfully ugly for the next year, what might become easier? You are talking with friends about a competition, a promotion at work, or a creative endeavor you are involved in. Someone asks you if you think you will succeed. Instantly, you shrug your shoulders, roll your eyes, and say, "I doubt it. I don't really care anyway." You aggressively downplay your own investment. But internally, your heart is pounding. You care deeply. You want it desperately. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the fear of losing the competition. It's the immediate, brutal exhaustion of pretending to be numb just to protect yourself from potential disappointment. Maybe you call yourself a realist. Maybe you think you simply prefer to manage your expectations to avoid getting hurt. Maybe you've started believing that being aloof and detached is just your personality. But this is not because you naturally lack passion. This is where the psychology of defensive pessimism and preemptive emotional numbing becomes profoundly relevant. Hoping for something makes you vulnerable to the pain of not getting it. Announcing your apathy creates an immediate protective shield against public and private failure. And that shield can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate emotional detachment with guaranteed safety from heartbreak. The problem is that what gives you relief from potential disappointment today can make your own internal drive feel completely inaccessible tomorrow. You might find yourself constantly making sarcastic jokes about your own dreams or refusing to celebrate small victories. It is like wearing a heavy, waterproof raincoat inside your house every single day just in case the roof leaks. At first, it feels like smart preparation, but eventually you forget what it feels like to just relax in your own home. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we say to others. They change what we naturally consider ourselves allowed to feel. If you repeatedly pretend you don't care to avoid the sting of failure, you may gradually become more comfortable with apathy than authentic enthusiasm. If you repeatedly suppress your hope, excitement may begin to feel less like a joy and more like a dangerous liability. If you repeatedly practice distancing yourself from your desires, your true passions may be lost to you forever. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have saved you from devastating letdowns in the past. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally cynical or detached. Maybe you've practiced preemptively rejecting your own desires so the world cannot take them away from you. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced admitting out loud that you truly want something for the next year, what might become easier? You decide you want to start a podcast, a garden, or a small business. So you start researching. You buy the best microphone, you read 10 books on soil composition, you watch 50 hours of tutorials on business strategy. You spend weeks preparing, but you never record the first episode. You never plant a single seed. You tell yourself you just need to read one more book to be fully prepared. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the lack of knowledge. It's the terrifying suspicion that you are using preparation as a hiding place. Maybe you call yourself thorough. Maybe you think you're simply being responsible and avoiding careless mistakes. Maybe you've started believing that chronic overpreparation is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally organized. This is where the psychology of the illusion of progress and action faking comes into play. Taking actual action involves the risk of being wrong. Researching creates an immediate, massive illusion of forward momentum without any of the actual risk, and that illusion can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate endless preparation with the feeling of achievement. The problem is that what makes you feel productive today can completely divorce you from the ability to take actual leaps of faith tomorrow. You might spend months designing a logo for a company that has 0 customers, or color-coding a study schedule without ever opening the textbook. It is like reading a manual on how to swim for 3 years while standing at the edge of the pool. At first, you think you are just being cautious, but eventually you realize the water is exactly as cold as it would have been 3 years ago. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we prepare, they change how we define our own capability. If you repeatedly substitute research for action, you may gradually become more comfortable with theoretical mastery than messy reality. If you repeatedly mistake planning for progress, stepping into the arena may begin to feel less like a natural progression and more like an impossible leap. If you repeatedly practice waiting to feel completely ready, the waiting room itself may begin to feel like your only home. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have helped you excel in structured academic environments. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you don't actually need more information. Maybe you've aggressively practiced using planning as a respectable excuse to avoid the vulnerability of the unknown. What if some of the things you call your personality are simply patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent? What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced starting before you were completely ready for the next year, what might become easier? You are hanging out with a group of friends. They suggest playing a new board game, trying a new sport, or doing an escape room. You have never done it before. Instantly, your chest tightens. You insist that you don't want to play. You offer to just watch, or you make an excuse about being tired. You sit on the sidelines while everyone else laughs and fumbles through the new activity. And strangely, the hardest part isn't missing out on the game. It's the immediate, silent realization that you would rather be bored and isolated than risk looking foolish for 10 minutes. Maybe you call yourself an observer. Maybe you think you simply know what you like and prefer to stick to it. Maybe you've started believing that being unadventurous is just your personality. But this is not because you naturally hate fun. This is where the psychology of a fixed mindset and the safe lane syndrome becomes relevant. When you believe your competence defines your worth, trying something new feels like putting your entire identity on trial. Sitting out creates an immediate protection from looking uncoordinated or slow. And that protection can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate staying in the safe lane with social survival. The problem is that what protects your dignity today can guarantee chronic internal stagnation tomorrow. You might find yourself ordering the exact same meal at every restaurant or refusing to dance at weddings. It is like building a massive, heavy iron fortress to protect yourself from a gentle summer breeze. It is incredibly effective for staying secure, but if the walls are too thick, you never get to feel the sun on your face. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we do on the weekends. They change whose life we are actually allowing to dictate our experiences. If you repeatedly shrink your world to avoid being bad at something, you may gradually become more comfortable with stagnation than joy. If you repeatedly let the fear of clumsiness ruin your environment, trying something new may begin to feel humiliating. If you repeatedly practice hiding in your comfort zone, stepping out of it may begin to feel like a threat to your survival. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have kept you away from genuinely harmful situations in the past. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally rigid. Maybe you've practiced prioritizing everyone else's perception of your competence over your own actual enjoyment of life. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practice being the worst player in the room on purpose for the next year, what might become easier? You finally finish a project, an essay, or a piece of art. You hand it over to your boss, your teacher, or a friend. But before they can even look at it, you open your mouth. You immediately list all of its flaws. You tell them it was rushed, the ending is weak, and you know the formatting is off. You aggressively tear down your own work. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the quality of the work. It's the heartbreaking realization that you do not trust your own efforts enough to let them stand on their own. Maybe you call yourself humble. Maybe you think you're simply being self-aware and beating them to the punch. Maybe you've started believing that being highly self-critical is just your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally modest. This is where the psychology of the preemptive apology and the control of rejection reaches its peak. We are often conditioned to believe that criticism hurts less if we say it first. Pointing out your own flaws creates an immediate, desperate reassurance that no one else can surprise you with a critique. And that reassurance can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate self-sabotage with emotional armor. The problem is that what deflects criticism today guarantees that you will never fully own your own power tomorrow. You might deflect every compliment you receive or constantly label your own achievements as lucky. Imagine taking a sledgehammer to your own car's windshield just so a thief can't break it. It certainly prevents the thief from doing the damage. But you are still driving around with shattered glass. The repetition has become automatic. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we present our work. They change how we view our fundamental right to be proud of ourselves. If you repeatedly attack your own efforts to avoid being attacked, you may gradually become more comfortable with self-deprecation than quiet confidence. If you repeatedly view pride as a danger, accepting praise may begin to feel less like a joy and more like a trap. If you repeatedly practice tearing down your own house, feeling at home in your own achievements may begin to feel like an impossible myth. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have kept you safe in environments where standing tall made you a target. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today, and what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally insecure. Maybe you have simply practiced abandoning your own pride to prevent other people from doing it for you. What if some of the things you call your personality are simply patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent? What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced handing over your work and remaining completely silent for the next year, what might become easier? But there is a deeper idea underneath all of this. We have been culturally conditioned to view immediate competence as a virtue. We are taught that getting it right the first time is the ultimate sign of intelligence. We mistake perfectionism for dedication, and we mistake cautiousness for wisdom. But refusing to try because you might be wrong does not actually serve you. It deprives the world of your authentic effort, and it deprives you of the beautiful, messy, transformative process of becoming. Understanding this difference between who you are and what you repeatedly practice is the key to untangling your identity from your fear of failure. Changing a pattern does not mean you have to completely destroy yourself to become a reckless, careless person. It does not mean you have to become arrogant or blind to your mistakes. It simply means giving yourself more choices. A steering wheel doesn't decide where a car must go. It simply gives the driver the ability to change direction when the road curves. Awareness works in a similar way. Realizing that you have been practicing the habit of shrinking does not instantly teleport you to a place of fearless action, but it gives you agency. It gives you the steering wheel back. Why does any of this matter? Because the small choices you make every single day are quietly building the architecture of your future mind. One day doesn't define you. One deleted sentence doesn't define you. One preemptive apology doesn't define you. One bad habit doesn't define you. But what you repeatedly return to deserves your attention. The small, quiet ways you stay in the safe lane, the subtle ways you research instead of act, the invisible ways you pretend you don't care. These are not insignificant simply because they are small. They are repeated, and repetition accumulates into a life. What are you practicing becoming? When you look at the life you have built and the potential you have quietly hidden away, are you practicing fear or are you practicing courage? You are allowed to be a beginner. You are allowed to be wrong. You are allowed to try. Because perhaps the person you become isn't decided in one dramatic, flawless moment of finally getting everything right. Perhaps they are being shaped quietly, gently, and inevitably in the things you do again tomorrow.